Late afternoon light was already fading when the railway cars screeched to a halt along the platform, metal grinding against metal in a sound that seemed to echo across the flat expanse of Texas prairie. The doors swung wide and cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of dust and mesquite. Out stepped men who had crossed an ocean they never imagined crossing, men whose boots had marched through deserts and mountains on another continent entirely, men who now found themselves deposited in a landscape so foreign it might as well have been another planet. These were soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, prisoners taken in North Africa and Europe, transported across the Atlantic in the holds of Allied ships, and now delivered to a sprawling camp constructed hastily in the middle of nowhere, Texas, in the closing months of 1943. Their uniforms bore the stains of long travel and longer defeat. Dust from African campaigns still clung to some of the fabric, despite ocean spray and rain. The grey-green wool hung loose on frames that had thinned from irregular rations during the voyage. Their faces showed exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind that settles into a man's bones when he realizes his war has ended, not in victory, but in captivity, thousands of miles from home. Guards in American uniforms shepherded them across the platform with gestures and broken commands, neither hostile nor friendly, simply efficient, moving human cargo from one point to another with the same practiced routine they might use for any shipment. The barracks loomed ahead, long wooden structures with tar paper roofs that seemed to stretch in endless rows across the flat land. Inside, the air smelled of fresh pine and sawdust, evidence of recent construction. The buildings were Spartan but adequate, built to military specifications that prioritized function over comfort. Bunks lined both walls in neat ranks, each frame supporting a thin mattress stuffed with straw or cotton batting. And on each bunk, folded with precise military corners, lay blankets issued by the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. The moment the prisoners filed into their assigned barracks and caught sight of those blankets, something shifted in the atmosphere. Fatigue gave way to astonishment, then quickly to derision. The blankets were light in colour, a pale grey or tan that looked almost white in the dim interior. More significantly, they were thin, far thinner than what these men had known throughout their military service. You could hold one up to the fading light from the window and see your hand's shadow through the weave. A tall man near the front, an officer who still carried himself with the bearing of command despite his current circumstances, reached down and lifted one of the blankets between thumb and forefinger. His name was Karl Weiss, a lieutenant who had served with Rommel's forces in Africa before capture. He held the fabric at arm's length as though it might contaminate him, his lip curling in open contempt. The sound that came from his throat was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff, harsh and dismissive. His voice carried through the barracks when he spoke, projecting with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. In Europe, he announced to no one in particular and everyone within earshot, even the freshest recruits, boys who had never seen combat, would not cover themselves with something so pathetic. This is not a blanket. This is a joke. His words opened floodgates. Laughter rippled through the assembled prisoners, bitter and mocking, edged with the kind of dark humour that soldiers develop when everything else has been stripped away. Men pulled the blankets off bunks and held them up, shaking them as if to demonstrate their inadequacy. Some slapped the thin fabric against their legs, producing soft sounds that only emphasized how light the material was. The comparison to proper German military blankets was immediate and unfavorable. These men had grown up with heavy wool, thick weaves that had substance and weight, blankets you could feel in your hands, blankets that announced their presence and purpose. A sergeant named Otto Rees, stocky and grey-haired despite being only in his 30s, examined one of the blankets with exaggerated scrutiny. He turned it over in his hands, stretched it slightly, then pronounced his verdict with theatrical disdain. This would be acceptable for polishing boots, perhaps, or as a rag for cleaning windows. But to call it bedding is an insult to the very concept of warmth. His assessment drew nods and murmurs of agreement. These men carried with them not just military experience, but cultural expectations about what proper equipment should be. Heavy meant durable. Weight signified quality. The substantial nature of thick wool represented German engineering principles applied to the simplest of objects. Everything in their training and experience had taught them that superior materials were inherently solid, that you could judge the worth of military supplies by their heft and density. Major Dieter Kraus, who had served as a quartermaster for a regiment stationed near Munich before the war expanded beyond anyone's initial predictions, spoke with the authority of someone who had actually managed supply chains. He stood near the centre of the barracks, surrounded by younger men who deferred to his expertise in matters of equipment and provisions. His voice held certainty when he explained that proper military blankets back home weighed nearly 5 kilograms each. You could wrap yourself in them and feel protected, almost armoured against the cold. Stack them on a bunk and they would create insulation thick enough to stop drafts from penetrating stone walls. That was what a blanket should be. The prisoners nodded as Kraus spoke, finding comfort in his words, in the familiar measurements and standards they understood. The mockery continued as men claimed their bunks and settled in. Some joked that the Americans must be saving their good supplies for their own troops, leaving scraps for prisoners. Others suggested this was what happened when a nation tried to outfit millions of soldiers quickly, cutting corners and accepting inferior products because quantity mattered more than quality. A few voices whispered darker theories, that this was deliberate, a subtle form of punishment or humiliation, giving captured enemy soldiers bedding that would prove inadequate when the weather turned. Karl Weiss tossed his blanket onto his assigned bunk with visible disgust, the thin fabric barely making a sound as it landed on the straw mattress. He looked around at his fellow prisoners, men he had fought alongside, men who shared his background and training and assumptions about the world. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of grim satisfaction, as if this discovery confirmed suspicions he had long held about American industrial capacity and priorities. They build everything with the same philosophy, he said, gesturing at the blanket. Cheap, lightweight, disposable. No craftsmanship, no tradition, just mass production of inferior goods. They may have factories that can churn out weapons and vehicles, but they do not understand quality. They do not understand that some things should not be made hastily or lightly. The speech resonated with men who wanted to believe it, who needed to believe it. Even in defeat, even as prisoners in a foreign land, they clung to the conviction that their way of doing things represented a superior approach. If they had to acknowledge American industrial might, they could at least persuade themselves that this power came at the cost of quality, that the enemy's abundance was built on shallow foundations of mass-produced mediocrity. As evening deepened into night, the barracks filled with the sounds of men settling into unfamiliar surroundings. Boots were unlaced and set beside bunks. Uniforms were hung on pegs or folded carefully despite their worn condition. The prisoners moved through routines developed over years of military service, finding small comfort in familiar rituals even in this strange new environment. Oil lamps were lit and placed at intervals along the barracks, casting warm yellow light that pushed back the gathering darkness but could do nothing about the cold that was beginning to seep through the walls. Outside, beyond the wooden buildings and wire fences, the Texas prairie stretched away in all directions, vast and empty. During the day, it had been merely unfamiliar, a landscape without mountains or forests, just endless flatness broken occasionally by scrubby vegetation. Now, as night claimed the land, it became something else entirely. Weather systems were moving across that emptiness, air masses sliding down from the northern plains without any obstacles to slow or deflect them. The temperature was dropping steadily, degree by degree, as a cold front pressed southward with unusual strength for this region and season. The guards who patrolled the perimeter of the camp had been warned about the forecast. They wore heavy coats and moved briskly, keeping circulation going against the chill. When they passed the barracks, they could hear the prisoners inside, voices speaking German in tones that ranged from bitter to resigned to occasionally amused. The guards understood little of the actual words, but the general sentiment was clear enough. The prisoners were not happy about something, probably the usual complaints about food or accommodations, or the simple fact of captivity itself. Captain Walter Mills, the American officer responsible for overseeing supply distribution at the camp, made his evening rounds with a clipboard tucked under one arm. He was a methodical man who had managed warehouses and logistics before the war, skills that translated well to military service even if they lacked the glamour of combat positions. He checked off items on his lists, confirming that each barracks had received its full allotment of bedding, that the stoves were functioning, that basic necessities were in place. When one of the guards mentioned hearing laughter from the German prisoners, Mills showed little reaction. "Let them laugh," he said without heat or judgment. "They will think differently by morning." The captain knew something the prisoners did not, could not know from their European experience. He understood the specifications of those thin blankets they had mocked so thoroughly. He had read the technical reports from textile manufacturers, had reviewed the material science behind the new synthetic blends being produced in American factories. Those blankets were not wool at all, despite appearances. They were woven from rayon and other man-made fibers, engineered specifically for military use, designed to provide maximum insulation while minimizing weight and bulk. The manufacturing process allowed for mass production on a scale that traditional wool craftsmanship could never match. A single factory in Massachusetts, Mills had learned during his training, could produce more than 250,000 blankets in a month. Other facilities across the Midwest and Northeast ran similar operations, churning out supplies in quantities that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The numbers were staggering when you actually stopped to consider them. Millions of blankets manufactured annually, distributed to bases and camps and ships across multiple continents. This was American industrial capacity in action, the ability to identify a need and then flood that need with standardized solutions produced en masse. But statistics and technical specifications meant nothing to the German prisoners settling into their bunks that first evening. They knew what they knew, understood what their experience had taught them. Heavy wool blankets had kept soldiers warm in Russian winters and alpine positions. Therefore, heavy wool represented the correct approach to the problem of cold weather protection. Light synthetic fabric, by this logic, must be inferior regardless of whatever claims manufacturers might make. The mockery that had greeted the American blankets was not just aesthetic preference. It was the clash between old-world certainty and new-world innovation, between traditional materials and modern chemistry, between the known and the unfamiliar. As the prisoners prepared for sleep, some continued to grumble about the inadequate bedding. A few attempted to use their uniform jackets as additional covering, folding the wool carefully and laying it across their bodies. Others simply resigned themselves to what they assumed would be an uncomfortable night, accepting it as one more indignity of captivity. Carl Weiss lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams, the thin American blanket pulled up to his chest more from habit than any expectation of actual warmth. He could feel cold air moving through the barracks, finding entry through gaps in the walls and around windows that did not quite seal properly. The temperature continued its steady decline. By the time full darkness settled over the camp, it had already dropped below what would normally be expected for this part of Texas in late autumn. The cold front was proving more severe than weather forecasters had initially predicted, bringing air that belonged hundreds of miles farther north. Prairie wind picked up strength, pushing against the barracks with increasing force. The wooden buildings creaked and groaned under the pressure, sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet of night. Inside, men gradually fell silent as exhaustion claimed them. Conversations tapered off into occasional murmurs, then into the rhythmic breathing of sleep. The oil lamps were extinguished one by one until only a single flame remained burning at the far end of the barracks, maintained as a safety measure and to provide minimal light for guards conducting periodic checks. Shadows pooled in the corners and stretched across the floor, deepening as the night advanced. The first hour passed without incident. Men slept fitfully, adjusting to unfamiliar mattresses and surroundings, their rest broken by the normal disruptions of dozens of bodies sharing close quarters. Some snored, others shifted restlessly, a few got up to use the latrine facilities at the end of the building. The cold was present, but not yet severe, merely uncomfortable rather than dangerous. Most of the prisoners had experienced far worse conditions during their military service. This was nothing compared to winter campaigns or high-altitude positions. But the temperature kept falling. The wind that had been merely strong became fierce, howling across the open prairie with a voice that seemed almost alive. It found every weakness in the barracks' construction, every crack and gap and imperfect seal, exploiting these openings to push cold air into the interior. The stoves provided heat at the center of each building, but could not adequately warm the ends or combat the drafts that moved like invisible rivers through the space. Frost began forming on the inside of windows, delicate patterns spreading across the glass. By midnight, the atmosphere in the barracks had changed entirely. The cold was no longer something to endure with stoic acceptance. It had become aggressive, invasive, demanding attention and response. Men who had been sleeping began to wake, roused by the chill penetrating even through fatigue. Breath condensed into visible clouds with each exhalation, white vapor hanging momentarily in the dim light before dissipating. The wooden bunks creaked constantly now as prisoners pulled their blankets tighter, curled into more compact positions, sought any method to conserve body heat. Carl Weiss found himself wide awake, every nerve aware of the cold that seemed to be seeping through his skin directly into his bones. He had pulled the thin American blanket up to his chin, gathering the edges and tucking them around his shoulders and sides, trying to eliminate any gaps where warmth might escape. And then, gradually, almost reluctantly, he began to notice something unexpected. The blanket was working. Despite its lightness, despite its apparent flimsiness, it was trapping his body heat with surprising efficiency. He moved one hand to press against the fabric from inside, feeling warmth radiating from his own chest. The material itself seemed to have taken on temperature, not cold like he would have expected from such thin cloth, but actually warm to the touch. The weave was doing something he did not entirely understand, creating tiny air pockets perhaps, or reflecting heat back toward his body through some property of the synthetic fibers. Whatever the mechanism, the result was undeniable. He was cold, yes, but he was not freezing. The blanket was providing genuine protection. Across the narrow aisle between bunks, Otto Ries was discovering the same thing. The sergeant had wrapped himself completely in his American-issued blanket, tucking the edges under his shoulders and legs and feet until he was essentially cocooned in the fabric. He had been certain this would prove inadequate, that he would spend the night shivering and cursing American incompetence. Instead, he felt warmth beginning to accumulate around his body, building slowly but steadily as the blanket trapped and held the heat his own metabolism generated. He wanted to cling to his earlier contempt, wanted to dismiss this as temporary or accidental, but simple physical reality was making that position difficult to maintain. Further down the barracks, a young private named Hans Keller was struggling. At barely 20 years old, thin and still weak from wounds received before his capture, he lacked the body mass and strength to generate adequate heat. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and he could feel cold settling deep into his core, the dangerous kind of chill that could progress to something worse if not addressed. He tried pulling his knees to his chest, tried rubbing his arms, tried everything he could think of to stay warm. The thin blanket seemed pathetically insufficient against the cold that was trying to claim him. Two other prisoners in nearby bunks noticed his distress. Without speaking, moving on some instinct of shared humanity that transcended nationality or military allegiance, they rose from their own beds and approached. One was a corporal from Bavaria, the other a former clerk from Hamburg. They positioned themselves on either side of the shivering young man, pressing close so that their combined body heat could help. All three pulled their American blankets together, overlapping the edges to create a larger shield against the cold. The arrangement was cramped and awkward, but it worked. Slowly, gradually, Hans Keller's shaking subsided. His breathing became more regular. Colour began returning to his face as circulation improved. The three men lay there in their improvised huddle, none of them willing to acknowledge aloud what was happening, that their survival in this moment depended entirely on the blankets they had ridiculed just hours earlier. The irony was too fresh, too raw to examine directly. Instead, they focused on the immediate sensation of warmth slowly spreading, of cold being pushed back inch by inch, of making it through one more hour and then another. All through the barracks, similar small revelations were occurring. Major Kraus, who had spoken so confidently about proper German military equipment, found himself grateful for the American blanket, despite his pride. He pulled it tight around his body and noticed that his hands, which had been growing numb, were beginning to regain feeling. A lieutenant from the Rhineland, who had joked about using the fabric for boot polish, discovered that when wrapped correctly, when tucked and sealed to eliminate drafts, the thin material created genuine insulation. A captain who had served on the Eastern Front and thought he knew everything about cold weather recognized that this strange synthetic cloth was performing better than he would have believed possible. No one spoke of it. The barracks remained mostly silent except for the wind outside and the occasional creak of wood or rustle of fabric as men adjusted their positions. But in that silence, attitudes were shifting, certainties were being questioned, arrogance was meeting reality and finding itself wanting. These were soldiers who had been trained to trust their equipment, to believe in the superiority of German engineering and materials. The thin American blanket was challenging those beliefs in the most fundamental way possible, through direct physical experience that could not be argued away or dismissed. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness. Each hour felt longer than the one before, as men waited for dawn, for the promise of sunrise and whatever warmth daylight might bring. The cold reached its deepest point in the hours just before morning, that dead time when darkness seems most absolute and the world feels suspended between night and day. The temperature inside the barracks dropped low enough that frost formed on metal bed frames, creating delicate crystalline patterns where condensation from breath and bodies met frozen surfaces. Outside, the prairie lay under a hard frost that turned the landscape silver in the starlight. Ice crystals covered every surface, every blade of grass, every fence post and wire. The guards who maintained their patrols moved quickly, their heavy coats and multiple layers barely adequate against the unusual cold. They could see their breath streaming out in thick clouds, could feel the air burning in their lungs with each inhalation. Some of them wondered about the prisoners in the barracks, whether the Germans were managing with just the standard issue bedding, whether anyone would freeze during the night. But inside those wooden buildings, wrapped in blankets they had mocked as worthless, the prisoners were surviving. Not comfortably, not easily, but surviving nonetheless. Bodies that had been cold to the point of real danger were maintaining temperature. Men who might have suffered from exposure or hypothermia were instead making it through the night with nothing worse than discomfort and restless sleep. The fabric that had seemed so inadequate was proving itself in the most crucial test possible, the simple preservation of human life against hostile conditions. Dawn arrived slowly, reluctantly, light seeping into the eastern sky in shades of grey and pale blue. The first rays of sun touched the highest points of the barracks' roofs, then gradually descended to illuminate walls and windows. Inside, men began stirring, roused by the growing light and the sounds of the camp coming to life around them. They unwrapped themselves from their blankets stiffly, muscles tight from cold and uncomfortable sleep, bodies protesting movement after hours of trying to conserve warmth. The barracks smelled of damp wood and human sweat, of breath and bodies, and the lingering scent of oil from the lamps. As prisoners sat up and looked around, as they began to assess their condition and that of their fellow captives, one fact became inescapably clear. Everyone had survived. Not a single man had frozen during the night. Not one had collapsed from hypothermia or suffered frostbite or experienced any of the dangerous consequences that severe cold could inflict on inadequately protected humans. Outside, visible through the windows, the ground lay white with heavy frost. It covered everything, a blanket of frozen crystals that testified to just how cold the night had actually been. This was not normal Texas weather. This was the kind of deep cold that could kill, that did kill when people were caught unprepared or without proper shelter. Yet inside the barracks, inside the thin wooden walls with their many gaps and imperfect insulation, dozens of prisoners had made it through with nothing but those light synthetic blankets they had scorned. The irony settled over the assembled men like a weight. They moved through their morning routines in near silence, washing from basins of cold water, dressing in their worn uniforms, preparing for whatever the day would bring. But underneath these mechanical actions ran a current of uncomfortable awareness. They had been wrong. Profoundly, completely wrong in their assessment of those American blankets. The object they had laughed at, had dismissed as inadequate and inferior, had literally saved their lives. Carl Weiss stood near his bunk, looking down at the blanket he had folded with automatic military precision despite the turmoil in his thoughts. His fingers traced the edge of the fabric, feeling its texture, its thinness. He had held this material in contempt less than 24 hours ago. Now he understood that it represented something he had not anticipated, had not been prepared to encounter. American industrial capacity was not just about quantity. It was about innovation, about solving problems in ways that traditional European thinking had not imagined or pursued. Sergeant Otto Rieser sat on the edge of his bunk, his grey hair dishevelled from sleep, his face showing the lines of a difficult night. He stared at his hands, flexing fingers that were stiff but functional, alive and responsive. He remembered his proclamation that the blanket would be suitable only for cleaning windows. The memory burned now with shame he was not quite ready to acknowledge openly. Everything he had been taught, everything he believed about military equipment and German superiority, had been challenged by one cold night and one thin piece of synthetic fabric. Major Kraus stood near the centre of the barracks, still maintaining the bearing of an officer despite captivity and defeat. Other prisoners looked to him for guidance, for some interpretation of what had happened and what it meant. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond, whether he would cling to pride or admit to error. The major was old enough and experienced enough to recognize a turning point when he encountered one. This was more than just being wrong about blankets. This touched on deeper questions about assumptions and biases, about the dangers of dismissing enemy capabilities based on preconceived notions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the barracks with the authority of command, but also with something else, a note of reluctant respect. "The Americans," he said carefully, "have surprised us. What they gave us appeared worthless, but it proved sufficient. We should remember this. We should remember that appearances can deceive, and that new methods sometimes work better than old ones, even when they seem strange or inadequate by familiar standards." His words hung in the air, neither a full admission of being wrong nor a defence of their earlier mockery, but something in between. The other prisoners received this pronouncement in silence, each man processing its implications in his own way. Some nodded slowly, accepting the logic even if it wounded their pride. Others remained sceptical, wanting to believe that last night had been an exception, that German wool would still prove superior in truly severe conditions. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. The frost outside spoke to the reality of the temperature, to the genuine danger they had all faced. And inside, everyone was alive and functional, protected by blankets that weighed almost nothing, that could be folded into compact bundles, that had been mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands in factories across America. The contrast between German and American approaches to military supply had never been more stark or more telling. As morning advanced and the sun climbed higher, its weak warmth began to melt the frost in patches. The camp stirred to life around the barracks, guards conducting roll calls, kitchen workers preparing breakfast, the machinery of military routine grinding forward. The German prisoners filed out for their morning count, standing in formation on ground still slick with melting ice, their breath steaming in the cold air that lingered despite daylight. While they stood at attention, an American supply wagon rolled past, loaded with additional blankets. The sight drew eyes from the assembled prisoners. Some watched with open curiosity, others with something approaching wonder. That wagon represented just a tiny fraction of American production capacity, a single shipment among thousands, blankets being distributed not just to this camp, but to dozens of others, to field hospitals, to frontline troops, to anyone who needed protection against cold. One of the guards, a sergeant who had been observing the German reactions, mentioned casually to a colleague that the blankets came from a factory in Massachusetts that produced more than 250,000 units per month. He said it loud enough for nearby prisoners to overhear, knowing they would understand at least the numbers, even if their English was limited. The information rippled through the ranks in whispers, German to German, spreading like a spark through dry grass. 250,000 per month. The figure was staggering to men who came from a nation where textile production was being rationed and restricted, where wool was stripped from civilian coats to provide material for military uniforms, where every resource was being stretched to its absolute limit in service of a war effort that was clearly failing. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. Germany was scraping to equip its forces while America was producing supplies in such abundance that even prisoners of war received new, purpose-built blankets rather than recycled cast-offs. The message penetrated deeper than any propaganda could have reached. These men had experienced American plenty, not as an abstract concept but as tangible reality, as the fabric that had kept them alive through a freezing night. They began to understand that the war they had fought was not just a contest of armies and ideologies, but also a competition of industrial systems. And in that competition, the gap between the two nations was wider than they had ever imagined from within the German information bubble. Throughout the day, conversations in the barracks circled back repeatedly to the blankets, to the night that had just passed, to the uncomfortable realizations that were emerging. Some prisoners tried to maintain that the cold had not been truly severe, that they would have survived regardless of the bedding quality. Others admitted more honestly that without those American blankets, casualties would have occurred, that men would have frozen, that the night could easily have turned deadly. Hans Keller, the young private who had come closest to serious danger, found himself at the center of quiet discussions. The two men who had helped him through the night by sharing their warmth checked on him repeatedly, making sure he had fully recovered from his close call. Keller himself seemed subdued, shaken not just by the cold, but by the larger implications of their situation. He had been taught that Germans represented civilization and sophistication, while Americans were crude materialists. But crude materialists did not develop advanced synthetic fabrics. They did not build industrial systems capable of producing millions of high-quality items. They did not, as a matter of policy, ensure that even enemy prisoners received adequate protection against the elements. An older corporal named Friedrich Weber, who had served in Poland and France before his capture in Italy, spent much of the day sitting quietly on his bunk, the American blanket folded beside him. He kept reaching out to touch the fabric, as if trying to understand through physical contact what his mind struggled to process. This simple object contradicted so much of what he believed, what he had been told, what the entire German propaganda machine had spent years drilling into the population. Americans were supposed to be soft, unprepared, incapable of matching European military prowess. Yet here was evidence of capability that exceeded anything his own country was producing. Captain Walter Mills made his rounds again that afternoon, checking on supplies and making notes on his ever-present clipboard. When he entered the barracks where the German officers were housed, he found Major Kraus waiting near the door, apparently hoping to catch him. Through a combination of limited English, basic German, and gestures, the two men managed a brief exchange. Kraus asked about the blankets, where they came from, how they were made. Mills explained as best he could about synthetic fibers, about rayon production, about the American textile industry's conversion to military manufacturing. The numbers Mills cited seemed impossible to Krauss. He listened with growing amazement as the American captain described factories running 3 shifts, production lines operating around the clock, warehouses filling faster than they could be emptied, transportation networks moving supplies to every corner of the American military machine and beyond. This was not boasting, Krauss realized. This was simply matter-of-fact description of reality, of an industrial capacity so vast it operated on a scale Germany had never achieved even at peak production. Later, Krauss shared what he had learned with the other German officers. They gathered in a small group, speaking in low voices, processing information that challenged their understanding of the war and their place in it. A lieutenant from Dresden pointed out that if America could produce blankets in such quantities, the same factories could just as easily be converted to produce uniforms, or tents, or parachutes, or any of countless other textile goods that armies required. A captain from Hamburg noted that this was just one category of supplies, that the same industrial philosophy surely applied to weapons and vehicles and all the material of modern warfare. The conversation grew more somber as implications multiplied. These were intelligent men, educated officers who had understood military logistics and strategy even before the collapse that led to their capture. They could see the larger picture emerging from the details of a single night and a single type of equipment. Germany was fighting against an enemy with resources so vast that even the waste and excess could equip entire armies. The blankets were symptoms of a deeper reality, proof that the war had perhaps been unwinnable from the start, that the industrial imbalance was simply too great to overcome through bravery or tactical skill or any of the factors German leadership had emphasized. As evening approached and the second night in the camp drew near, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from 24 hours earlier. Where there had been mockery, there was now caution. Where there had been confidence in German superiority, there was now doubt. The prisoners prepared for sleep with none of the previous night's laughter and derision. Instead, they handled the thin American blankets with something approaching respect, spreading them carefully on their bunks, tucking edges to minimize drafts, recognizing that these objects represented their primary defense against another cold night. The temperature was forecast to drop again, perhaps not as severely as the previous night, but still well below normal for the region and season. As darkness fell and the barracks grew quiet, men wrapped themselves in their blankets with conscious gratitude rather than contempt. Karl Weiss lay on his bunk, the light fabric pulled up to his shoulders, and allowed himself to whisper into the darkness what many others were thinking but not saying. Without these blankets, he admitted in a voice barely audible above the wind outside, half of us would have frozen, maybe more. His words carried to nearby bunks where other prisoners lay listening in the dim light from the single oil lamp that still burned. No one responded verbally, but the silence felt different from the previous night's mocking camaraderie. This was the silence of men confronting uncomfortable truths, of soldiers realizing that their enemies possessed strengths they had not anticipated or respected. The blanket that each man clutched was no longer just bedding. It had become evidence, tangible proof that their assumptions had been wrong. Major Krauss, lying awake on his bunk, found his mind returning to memories of the quartermaster depot near Munich where he had once worked. He remembered the careful inventory of wool blankets, the pride taken in their weight and quality, the certainty that German military equipment represented the peak of industrial achievement. Now he understood that weight was not the same as effectiveness, that tradition could blind you to innovation, that the old ways were not automatically the best ways simply because they were familiar. Otto Rieser wrapped his blanket around himself with movements that had become almost ritual, finding comfort in the routine even as he grappled with larger questions about what this experience meant. He had spent an entire military career believing in the superiority of German methods and materials. One cold night had shaken that faith more thoroughly than any defeat on the battlefield. The blanket was warm against his skin, light but effective, a daily reminder that his entire framework for understanding the world might need revision. Young Hans Keller settled into sleep more easily than the previous night. His body recovered from its close call with hypothermia. But his mind carried new weight. He was too young to have deeply ingrained beliefs about German supremacy, too inexperienced to have invested his identity in national mythology. What he felt now was simpler and more immediate: gratitude. The Americans who had captured him, who held him prisoner, who by every logic of war should have been his mortal enemies, had given him something that preserved his life. That fact was uncomplicated by propaganda or politics. It simply was. The night passed more easily than the first. The prisoners knew what to expect now, understood how to wrap themselves for maximum warmth retention, trusted that the blankets would perform their function. Sleep came more readily, even though the temperature outside remained brutal. Bodies rested rather than fighting constantly against cold. By morning, the second sunrise of captivity, the barracks woke to men who had managed something approaching genuine rest. The pattern continued through the following days, as the cold snap persisted longer than weather forecasters had predicted. Each night, the prisoners wrapped themselves in American blankets. Each morning, they woke alive and functional. The routine became normalized, unremarkable, just another aspect of life in the camp. But underneath that normality, something had fundamentally changed in how these men understood their situation and themselves. Conversations began to shift beyond just the blankets to larger questions about American society and industry. How did they develop synthetic fibers? What other innovations had emerged from their research laboratories and manufacturing facilities? If they could mass-produce blankets with such efficiency, what did that suggest about their capacity to build aircraft, tanks, ships, weapons? The prisoners had access to no current news, no information about how the war was progressing beyond these barbed wire fences. But they could extrapolate from what they experienced directly, and the conclusions were sobering. A corporal from the Ruhr region, an industrial area in Germany, spoke one afternoon about how factories back home had been operating at absolute maximum capacity for years, pushing every machine and worker to the limit just to maintain production levels that were clearly insufficient for the demands of a multi-front war. He described the shortages, the substitutions, the constant pressure to make do with less. Then he gestured at the blankets that lay folded on every bunk in the barracks. "This," he said quietly, "is what abundance looks like. This is what it means to have industrial capacity in reserve, to produce not just enough but more than enough, to have supplies left over for prisoners while still equipping your own forces fully." His words resonated with others who had worked in manufacturing or logistics, who understood the complexities of industrial production and supply chains. They could recognize excellence when they encountered it, even in something as humble as a blanket. The American system had produced a superior product through innovation, rather than simply throwing more traditional materials and labor at the problem. That suggested a different way of thinking about challenges, a different approach to solving problems. As the cold weather finally began to moderate, as temperatures climbed back towards seasonal norms and the risk of freezing nights receded, the prisoners found themselves facing a psychological challenge perhaps more difficult than the physical trials of that first brutal night. They had to incorporate these new understandings into their sense of self and nationality. They had to reconcile the evidence of American capability with the propaganda that had told them for years that Germans were inherently superior. Some chose denial, clinging to beliefs that had become central to their identity. They convinced themselves that the blankets were flukes, that German wool would have worked just as well, that any suggestion otherwise was falling for enemy psychological warfare. These men remained bitter and closed, resistant to any evidence that contradicted their worldview. They would carry that rigidity with them through the rest of their time as prisoners and beyond, never quite able to process what had happened. But others, perhaps the majority, allowed the experience to crack open their certainties at least a little. They did not abandon German identity or pride, but they stopped automatically assuming that everything German was better simply because it was German. They developed what might be called epistemological humility, a recognition that their understanding of the world had been incomplete, that reality was more complex than propaganda had suggested, that enemies could possess genuine strengths rather than simply weaknesses to be exploited. Days stretched into weeks, and the camp routine solidified into patterns. The prisoners worked at various labour assignments, tended gardens, performed maintenance on the camp buildings, occupied themselves with reading and writing letters, and the countless small activities that filled the hours of captivity. But the blankets remained, folded on their bunks each morning, spread for warmth each night, a constant presence that carried weight beyond their physical substance. Carl Weiss found himself thinking about the blankets at odd moments, while washing his clothes or standing in formation for roll call or lying awake in the darkness. He tried to remember the exact tone of mockery he had used that first evening, the precise words he had chosen to dismiss the fabric as worthless. The memory embarrassed him now in a way that battlefield defeats did not. He had been wrong not through lack of courage or poor tactics, but through simple arrogance, through assuming he understood something he had never actually examined or tested. Otto Rees began keeping a journal, writing in small, careful script on pages he had begged from one of the guards. He documented life in the camp, but kept returning to the theme of the blankets, to that first night and the revelation it had brought. Years later, if he survived to return home, he wanted to remember this precisely because the memory was uncomfortable, because it forced him to confront his own capacity for blindness and prejudice. Major Krauss organised evening discussions among the German officers, informal gatherings where they could talk frankly about their experiences and try to make sense of their situation. The blankets came up frequently in these conversations, used as a starting point for broader discussions about technology, industry, national character, the nature of power in the modern world. Some officers argued that Germany's ultimate fate had been sealed not by tactical mistakes or strategic blunders, but by the simple mathematics of industrial production, that no amount of military skill could overcome being outproduced 10-1 or 20-1 in basic supplies and equipment. The discussions sometimes grew heated, with voices raised and pride still flaring when certain sensitive points were touched. But gradually, over time, even the most resistant officers began to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. The blankets served as Exhibit A in a case that built itself through accumulated evidence. Every day brought fresh proof of American abundance, from the food in the mess hall to the new uniforms issued when old ones wore out to the casual way guards discarded items that would have been carefully recycled and reused in Germany. Winter turned toward spring, though in Texas the transition was less dramatic than it would have been in Europe. Temperatures moderated, frost became rare, the need for blankets at night diminished. Some prisoners requested permission to store their blankets, to pack them away until next winter since they were no longer necessary for warmth. The request was granted with typical American pragmatism. Extra blankets were collected and stored in camp warehouses, logged and inventoried with the same casual efficiency that characterized all American military logistics. But many prisoners chose to keep their blankets regardless of weather. They continued spreading them on their bunks each night, even when the air was warm enough to sleep uncovered. The fabric had become something more than just equipment. It was a talisman, a reminder, a piece of evidence that carried meaning beyond its practical function. These men had formed relationships with objects that had saved their lives, connections that persisted even when rational necessity had ended. Spring brought rumours that filtered into the camp through guards and delivery workers and the mysterious networks by which information always spreads through military installations. The war in Europe was going badly for Germany, cities falling, armies retreating, the Reich contracting on all fronts. The prisoners received this news with varying reactions, from stubborn disbelief to resigned acceptance to outright relief that the madness might finally be ending. Those who had begun questioning their assumptions during that first cold night tended toward acceptance. They had already started the process of letting go of certainties. Further defeats simply confirmed what they had already suspected, that the war had been lost long before they personally experienced capture. As weeks became months, the camp population grew as more prisoners arrived from various theatres of war. The newcomers went through similar experiences, receiving their American blankets and initially reacting with mockery or skepticism until the first cold night taught them otherwise. The veterans of that initial November cold snap watched with knowing expressions, recognizing their own earlier arrogance reflected in the fresh arrivals. Some took quiet satisfaction in seeing others learn the same lessons. Others felt only sadness at how predictable human nature was, how reliably pride preceded understanding. Carl Weiss found himself assigned to help orient new prisoners, explaining camp rules and procedures. He made a point of telling the newcomers not to judge the American equipment by appearance or first impressions. "The blankets are thin," he would say, "but they work. Trust them, and they will keep you alive." Some listened. Others dismissed his advice as the words of a broken man who had given up German pride. Those who dismissed him inevitably learned the same lessons he had learned, usually through the same mechanism of a cold night and unexpected survival. Hans Keller had grown stronger during his months in the camp, filling out from regular meals and absence of combat stress. He no longer looked like a frightened boy, but rather like a young man who had been forced to mature quickly under difficult circumstances. He kept his American blanket folded at the foot of his bunk with almost reverent care, remembering the night when only that fabric and the kindness of two strangers had stood between him and death from cold. When he allowed himself to imagine returning home to Germany someday, he wondered if he would be permitted to take the blanket with him, to carry this tangible reminder of a lesson learned in captivity. The question of what would happen to them after the war ended loomed larger as Allied victories multiplied and German defeat became inevitable rather than merely probable. Would they be returned home quickly or held for years? Would Germany even exist as a nation after total surrender, or would it be partitioned and absorbed? The prisoners debated these questions endlessly, but could reach no conclusions. Their future was entirely in the hands of others, dependent on political decisions being made in distant capitals by leaders whose names they knew, but whose thinking they could not predict. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. News of the capitulation reached the Texas camp within hours, spreading through the compound like wildfire. Men reacted according to their dispositions and beliefs. Some wept openly, mourning the destruction of everything they had known. Others celebrated quietly, relieved that the killing had finally stopped. Most simply absorbed the information in silence, processing its meaning and implications in private contemplation. The immediate aftermath of surrender brought uncertainty. Would the prisoners be released and repatriated? Held for labor assignments? Put on trial for war crimes? Weeks passed with no clear answers as American authorities worked through complex questions of logistics and policy. The camp routine continued largely unchanged, sustained by bureaucratic momentum, even though its original justification had vanished with the end of hostilities. During this waiting period, some prisoners requested permission to write letters home, though mail service to Germany was chaotic and uncertain. Those who attempted letters found themselves describing their experiences in the camp, trying to explain to family members what captivity in America had been like. More than one letter mentioned the blankets, that first cold night, the revelation of being wrong about enemy capabilities. The act of writing it down, of putting into words what they had experienced and learned, helped some men clarify their own thinking about events that had seemed confusing or contradictory in the moment. Otto Rieser wrote to his wife in Hamburg, telling her about the blankets in language that mixed practical description with deeper reflection. He tried to convey how a simple object had shifted his understanding not just of Americans, but of the nature of warfare in the modern age, of the crucial role that industrial production played in determining outcomes between nations. He wondered if she would understand what he was trying to communicate, whether someone who had lived through the war from inside Germany could grasp lessons learned in a Texas prisoner camp. Major Krauss composed letters to former colleagues in the German military, men he had served with who were presumably now scattered across occupied Germany, or perhaps also being held in various Allied detention facilities. He described the camp, the treatment they had received, the supplies and equipment that had been provided. His tone was factual rather than emotional, a quartermaster's assessment of American logistics and industrial capacity. The blankets featured prominently in his analysis as evidence of manufacturing sophistication that exceeded what German industry had achieved even at its pre-war peak. As summer arrived, bringing heat that made the barracks uncomfortable in a different way than winter cold had done, plans for repatriation finally began taking shape. Prisoners would be processed in groups, screened for potential war crimes, then transported to ports for voyage back across the Atlantic. The timeline stretched over months rather than weeks, complicated by the sheer numbers of German prisoners held in camps across the United States and by ongoing investigations into individual backgrounds. When told that repatriation was approaching, many prisoners asked about taking possessions with them. Regulations allowed limited personal items, but generally required that military equipment and supplies remain in American hands. The blankets fell into an ambiguous category, technically military property, but also imbued with personal significance for men who had literally depended on them for survival. Individual camp commanders interpreted the rules with varying strictness. Some insisted blankets must be left behind, inventoried and stored for potential future use. Others looked the other way when prisoners tucked folded blankets into their sparse luggage. Carl Weiss, learning that his group would ship out within the week, carefully folded his American blanket and placed it in his small bag alongside a few letters and photographs. If questioned at the port, he would have to surrender it, but he would try to keep this object that had come to mean so much. The fabric was wearing thin in places from months of use, the edges slightly frayed, the colour faded from repeated washing. It looked even less impressive now than it had that first night when it lay fresh and new on the bunk. Yet Weiss valued it more than any medal or decoration from his years of military service. Hans Keller also packed his blanket, folding it with the same care he had shown for months. At 21, he was still young enough that much of his adult life lay ahead, assuming he could successfully navigate the chaos of post-war Germany. He wanted to keep the blanket as a reminder, not just of survival, but of the larger lessons the experience had taught him about assumptions and arrogance and the dangers of believing your own propaganda. He suspected these would be important lessons in whatever future awaited him. Otto Rieser, older and more pragmatic, initially planned to leave his blanket behind, figuring that taking American military property would only create problems during processing. But as his departure date approached, he reconsidered, motivated less by sentiment than by a historian's instinct to preserve evidence. This blanket represented a specific moment in history, a tangible connection to experiences that he felt should not be forgotten. He folded it carefully and added it to his bag, prepared to argue for keeping it if challenged, but hoping the confusion of mass repatriation would allow it to slip through unnoticed. Major Krauss, true to his quartermaster training, catalogued his blanket in his personal records with the same precision he had once applied to military inventory. He noted the approximate date of manufacture based on markings, estimated the material's composition from appearance and behaviour, documented how many nights he had used it and under what conditions. If he managed to bring it home to Munich, it would join other artifacts from his military career in careful storage, each item tagged and described for whatever future historians might eventually examine such collections. The day of departure arrived for the first group of prisoners with a mixture of relief and trepidation. They assembled before dawn on the parade ground where they had stood for so many roll calls, carrying their meagre possessions and wearing the same worn uniforms that had seen them through capture and captivity. Guards conducted final checks, ensuring everyone was accounted for and that no unauthorized items were being removed. The inspection of personal bags was cursory, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and baggage. Blankets that prisoners had carefully packed went largely unnoticed or deliberately overlooked by guards who perhaps understood their significance. Trucks carried them to the nearest rail junction, where a train waited to transport them to the Gulf Coast. The journey across Texas took 2 days, rolling through landscape that still looked alien to European eyes, even after months of captivity in the region. They passed through small towns and agricultural areas, crossed rivers and prairies, watched America slide past the windows, while contemplating return to a homeland that would likely be unrecognizable after total defeat and occupation. At the port, processing took another week, as thousands of prisoners were screened, documented, organized into groups for specific ships making the Atlantic crossing. The blankets in their luggage made it through various checkpoints, either too insignificant to merit confiscation or simply lost in the chaos of managing mass repatriation. When Carl Weiss finally boarded the Liberty ship that would carry him back across the ocean, his blanket was still folded in his bag, a survivor of the journey like its owner. The voyage across the Atlantic was rough, autumn storms making the passage miserable for men crowded into holds that had been configured to carry cargo rather than human beings comfortably. The thin American blankets proved valuable once again as temperatures dropped and seasickness made adequate sleep nearly impossible. Men wrapped themselves in the familiar fabric, finding small comfort in its presence, remembering warmer nights in Texas barracks that now seemed distant and dreamlike. Europe appeared finally as a grey line on the horizon, growing more distinct as the ship approached land. Germany itself was divided among the victorious powers, partitioned into occupation zones under British, American, French and Soviet control. The prisoners were disembarked at different ports depending on where they had originally come from and which zone their homes now fell within. Processing continued on European soil, more documentation and screening and bureaucratic machinery grinding through endless individual cases. Hans Keller landed at a port in the British zone, still clutching his bag with its concealed American blanket. He was young enough and junior enough in rank to clear screening quickly, deemed unlikely to have been involved in war crimes based on his age and service record. Within days of landing, he was released with papers that would allow him to travel home to Bremen, or what remained of Bremen after years of Allied bombing. The city he remembered from his youth existed now mostly as rubble, but family survived there, and he made his way through destroyed streets to a reunion that mixed joy with sorrow for everything and everyone lost. The blanket came with him, tucked into his bag through checkpoints and searches and the chaotic journey through occupied Germany. When he finally reached the apartment where his mother and younger sister lived in 3 cramped rooms of a building whose upper floors had been destroyed, he unpacked his meagre possessions and showed them what he had brought home from America. The blanket puzzled his mother, who could not understand why he would have taken a piece of enemy military equipment when he had so little room for anything. But Keller tried to explain, describing that first night of cold and his near brush with freezing to death and the realization that had come with dawn that his survival depended on something he had scorned. His mother listened without fully comprehending, focused more on the immediate concerns of finding food and fuel in a devastated nation. Still, she helped him fold the blanket and find space for it in the small trunk that held what remained of the family's possessions. It would stay there for years, occasionally brought out and aired, a faded reminder of lessons learned far from home. Carl Weiss made his way back to Stuttgart, or the ruins that had been Stuttgart before the bombing campaigns turned much of the city to wreckage. His family home no longer existed, reduced to foundation stones and rubble, but he located his wife and daughter living with relatives on the outskirts. The reunion was bittersweet, marked by relief at survival, but shadowed by years of separation and the difficult adjustments required of a defeated soldier trying to find his place in a shattered society. He kept the American blanket in his new circumstances, a single room in a commandeered building where multiple families shared facilities and privacy was nearly impossible. On cold nights he would use it still, wrapping himself in fabric that had once represented enemy abundance and now symbolized survival through the hardest periods of his life. His daughter, too young to remember her father before the war, would later write that she grew up seeing that blanket as a permanent fixture of their home, faded and worn, but treated with respect she did not fully understand until much older. Otto Riese returned to Hamburg to find his house intact, but requisitioned by British occupation authorities for housing military personnel. His wife and children lived in 2 rooms of what had been their family home, while British officers occupied the rest. The humiliation of this arrangement was partially offset by relief that the building had survived the firestorms that had consumed much of Hamburg in 1943. Riese found work slowly, using his organizational skills to help with reconstruction efforts, living in reduced circumstances but managing to keep his family fed during the hardest years of occupation and scarcity. The blanket became part of his household, used by his children on cold nights when fuel for heating was impossible to obtain. Riese would tell them stories about America, about the camp in Texas, about learning that thin could be stronger than thick and light more effective than heavy. His children absorbed these stories imperfectly, more interested in immediate concerns of childhood than in father's philosophical musings about lessons learned in captivity. But the stories were told nonetheless, preserving memory even when full understanding remained elusive. Major Kraus had the most difficult return, his rank and position making him subject to more intensive screening for potential war crimes. He spent months in detention camps being questioned about his service record and contacts with Nazi leadership. Eventually cleared of serious charges, he was released to return to Munich, where his wife had somehow preserved their apartment through years of bombing and chaos. His health had deteriorated during captivity and the subsequent detention, leaving him unable to work at the level he once had maintained. But he kept his records, including the detailed notes about American manufacturing capacity and the blankets that had revealed the truth about industrial warfare. In the years after his release, Kraus wrote extensively about his observations, producing a manuscript that analyzed American logistics and production methods with the thoroughness of a quartermaster who understood supply chains. The manuscript was never published in his lifetime, deemed too sensitive for the early Cold War period when former enemies were becoming allies against new threats. But it survived in family archives, a detailed accounting of one officer's realization that Germany had lost the war in factories and warehouses as much as on battlefields. The blanket itself became a teaching tool for Kraus, something he could show younger Germans who had not lived through the war and could not quite grasp the scale of American industrial power. He would spread the worn fabric out and explain its significance, describing that first night of cold and the mockery that had preceded the revelation of effectiveness. Some listeners understood, others remained skeptical, but the physical presence of the object helped make abstract concepts more tangible and immediate. As years passed and the initial chaos of defeat and occupation gave way to reconstruction and eventual prosperity, the blankets faded from everyday use in most households. Germany rebuilt, modernized, integrated into Western economic and military structures. The American blankets that prisoners had brought home became relics, historical curiosities stored in attics or donated to museums collecting artifacts from the war years. Some were thrown away as families cleaned out possessions and discarded reminders of difficult times they preferred to forget. But a surprising number survived, preserved by veterans who could not bring themselves to discard the fabric that had saved their lives. These blankets became heirlooms passed to children and grandchildren, accompanied by stories that attempted to convey why these worn pieces of cloth mattered so much. The stories evolved in the telling, details shifting, emphasis changing, but the core remained consistent. There had been a night of terrible cold. The blankets had seemed inadequate but proved sufficient. Survival had depended on what had been scorned. Hans Keller kept his blanket for more than 50 years, bringing it out occasionally to show grandchildren who found it hard to believe that such a thin old rag had ever mattered to anyone. He tried to explain about assumptions and prejudice and the importance of testing beliefs against reality, but these lessons were difficult to convey to children growing up in prosperous late 20th century Germany. Still, he told the stories, hoping something would lodge in young minds and perhaps influence how they thought about other people and other nations. Carl Weiss died in the 1970s, the blanket still among his possessions. His daughter inherited it along with other mementos of his military service. She had heard the stories throughout her childhood, but had never quite grasped why her father attached such significance to a blanket. Only later, as an adult studying the history of the period, did she begin to understand the psychological and cultural dimensions of what the blanket represented. She donated it eventually to a museum in Stuttgart that was collecting items related to prisoner of war experiences, wanting it preserved and contextualized for future generations who would need explanation to understand its meaning. Otto Ries's blanket went to one of his children, who kept it out of filial duty rather than personal attachment. It sat in a closet for decades, occasionally discovered during cleaning but never discarded. A fragment of family history whose significance had faded with time and generational distance. When that child downsized to move into a retirement home, the blanket was finally donated to a local historical society that maintained archives of World War II materials from ordinary citizens rather than military or political leaders. Major Krause's blanket became part of a larger collection of his papers and artifacts housed at a university archive in Munich. Researchers studying American logistics and industrial production during the war would occasionally request to examine it, appreciating the physical evidence that accompanied Krause's detailed written analysis. The blanket served as a teaching aid in seminars about military history and industrial economics, a tangible connection to abstract concepts about manufacturing capacity and technological innovation. Museums across Germany and the United States eventually acquired similar blankets from various sources, recognizing their value as artifacts that could illustrate aspects of the prisoner of war experience and the broader industrial dimensions of the conflict. Display cases would present them alongside explanatory text that tried to convey to modern viewers why these thin pieces of fabric had mattered so profoundly to the men who had used them. The physical reality of the objects helped make the stories more credible, provided evidence that this was not just a pleasant fable about enemies showing kindness, but rather documented history preserved in material form. Historians who studied prisoner of war camps found the blanket story appearing repeatedly in memoirs and oral histories collected from German veterans. The accounts showed remarkable consistency, despite coming from different individuals in different camps across the United States. The pattern suggested this had been a common experience, that many German prisoners had gone through similar revelations upon encountering American military supplies that worked differently than expected. The blankets became a small but telling data point in larger analyses of how captivity in the United States affected German prisoners psychologically and politically. Some scholars argued that experiences like the blanket revelation contributed to Germany's relatively smooth integration into the Western Alliance after the war. Men who had spent years as American prisoners of war returned home with more nuanced views of the United States than those who had experienced only combat or propaganda. They understood that Americans were neither the crude barbarians of Nazi caricature nor the perfect saviors of some idealized democracy, but rather practical people who solved problems through innovation and abundance. This more realistic assessment made it easier to accept American leadership in post-war Europe and to participate in institutions like NATO that linked former enemies in common cause. Other historians pointed to the blanket stories as examples of how small gestures and simple objects could have disproportionate psychological impact. The blankets cost almost nothing to produce compared to weapons or vehicles, represented a tiny fraction of American military expenditure, yet created impressions and memories that persisted for decades. They demonstrated that soft power, the ability to influence through attraction and competence rather than coercion, operated even in contexts like prisoner camps where coercion was readily available and would have been easy to justify. The blankets also featured in discussions about American exceptionalism and national identity. The ability to mass-produce high-quality goods efficiently represented a distinctly American contribution to military logistics, an expression of values that prioritized practical results over traditional methods. Where European militaries might have been bound by conventional thinking about equipment weight and materials, American manufacturers felt free to experiment with synthetic fibers and new production techniques. This willingness to innovate and discard tradition when better alternatives appeared seemed characteristically American to scholars analyzing national differences in approach to industrial problems. By the late 20th century, veterans of the original experiences were dying, taking with them the direct memory of that first cold night and the blankets that saved lives. But their stories had been recorded, their artifacts preserved, their lessons documented for future generations. The thin American blankets had outlived most of the men who scorned and then learned to value them, surviving as witnesses to a moment when pride met reality and found itself transformed. The lesson extended beyond the specific historical moment. In classrooms where the story was taught, it served as a case study in the dangers of assumption and the importance of empirical testing. Students were asked to consider how the German prisoners' initial mockery stemmed from cultural biases and incomplete information, how their certainty about blanket quality reflected broader certainties about national and cultural superiority. The revelation that came with the cold night demonstrated what happened when those certainties encountered objective reality that did not care about beliefs or traditions. The story resonated particularly in discussions about innovation and resistance to change. The German prisoners represented a common human tendency to dismiss the unfamiliar, to assume that departures from tradition must be inferior to established methods. Their experience illustrated how this conservatism could be dangerous, how clinging to old ways simply because they were old could blind you to better alternatives. The blankets worked precisely because they abandoned traditional approaches in favor of synthetic materials and mass production, yet their effectiveness was invisible to people who could not see past their unconventional nature. Educators using the blanket story would point out that similar dynamics appeared throughout history whenever new technologies or methods challenged established practices. The pattern repeated across contexts, from military equipment to business practices to social institutions. Those who innovated faced skepticism and mockery from defenders of tradition. Those defenders often had to learn through experience, sometimes painful experience, that novelty and improvement were not mutually exclusive, that respecting heritage did not require rejecting all change. The story also worked as a parable about humility and the limits of knowledge. The German prisoners were not stupid or ignorant in any absolute sense. They were educated men, many with technical training and extensive experience with military equipment. Yet their knowledge had blind spots, areas where assumptions replaced actual understanding. The blanket episode revealed those blind spots in an undeniable way, forcing recognition that they did not know everything they thought they knew. That recognition, uncomfortable as it was, opened space for learning and growth that absolute certainty would have foreclosed. In memorials and commemorations of the prisoner of war experience, the blankets sometimes appeared as symbols of an unexpected mercy, evidence that even during wartime, when hatred might seem justified and natural, human beings retained capacity for basic decency. The Americans who provided adequate bedding to captured enemies could have chosen otherwise, could have rationalized punishment or neglect as appropriate treatment for soldiers of an evil regime. Instead, they followed policies that maintained minimal standards of humane treatment, policies that provided survival necessities even when doing so served no obvious strategic advantage. This aspect of the story carried particular weight in contexts where people grappled with questions about how to treat enemies and adversaries. The blankets demonstrated that protecting opponent welfare did not require abandoning your own side or agreeing with enemy ideology. The American guards who distributed blankets remained loyal to their own nation while recognizing common humanity in the men they guarded. That balance, maintaining firm opposition to Nazi Germany while treating individual German soldiers with basic decency, required moral sophistication that the blanket story illustrated through concrete example rather than abstract principle. Some commentators noted ironies in the story that went beyond the obvious reversal of prisoner expectations. The German military had prided itself on logistics and organization, on the methodical approach to warfare that their general staff system exemplified. Yet American industry, dismissed by Nazi propaganda as chaotic and profit-driven, had produced logistics solutions that outperformed German equivalents. The blankets crystallized this reversal, showing that market-driven innovation could achieve results that centrally planned military bureaucracies struggled to match. The economic implications extended further when analysts considered how the blanket episode reflected larger patterns of industrial competition. Germany had entered the war with significant manufacturing capacity and technical expertise, advantages that early victories had expanded through conquest of other industrial regions. Yet American productive capacity, once fully mobilized, proved overwhelming, despite starting from a smaller military-industrial base. The blankets represented just one tiny fraction of that productive miracle, but they made the larger story tangible and personal in ways that statistics about tank or aircraft production rarely achieved. In the end, across all the different contexts and purposes for which the blanket story was told and retold, certain core themes remained constant. Pride had preceded understanding. Assumptions had been tested against reality. Objects initially scorned had proven their worth through simple performance. Enemies had shown unexpected capability and basic human decency. And from these elements, men had emerged changed, forced to reconsider beliefs they had held with absolute certainty until experience demonstrated otherwise. The thin American blankets had been manufactured by the millions, distributed without ceremony or special significance, used and discarded and replaced as part of vast logistical systems that operated across continents. Yet for a handful of German prisoners in a Texas camp in late 1943, those blankets became something more. They became evidence, symbols, teachers, bridges between opposing worldviews. They became objects that persisted in memory long after their material substance had faded and worn away. They became, in the end, witnesses to the simple truth that strength takes many forms, and that sometimes the lightest touch carries the heaviest meaning.